Hello, everybody, and welcome to this next series of lectures on stakeholder engagement. This is definitely a topic that I feel very strongly about. I suppose in your line of work, in nonprofit organizations, you would see the importance of maintaining good relationships, and perhaps it becomes a bit of a challenge when managing and balancing out the different interests of all of your stakeholders. So, in a nutshell, I would say the next few topics that we'll be covering within stakeholder engagement within the module are of really great importance to managing and growing your organization. The one thing that I could definitely say about stakeholder engagement, hands down, the single most important element of running any organization is stakeholder engagement, which is a fancy way of saying building and maintaining relationships. Whether you're running a business, an NPO, or any form of organization that requires the input and collaboration of other interest groups, maintaining relationships is without doubt and can't be overemphasized. That is the most important element of running and growing your business. So over the next few slides, we'll be looking at a number of key elements around stakeholder engagement, all with a view of enabling you to navigate through the space of maintaining and balancing out relationships. Some background to who I am. We have met before, but just a quick recap. I'm a CA by training, spent a few years in the academic sector, then completed my MBA at Oxford University, and then came back to South Africa and now run a social impact organization. All right, so over the next few modules, we will be looking at 3 voiceover PowerPoint presentations, with this one being the first. So stakeholder engagement theory and its fundamentals. So in the course of this lecture, we'll be looking at the basics of stakeholder engagement theory. In essence, what stakeholder engagement is all about, how it is defined, what are the elements, and how you start building your understanding of what the constituent elements are of stakeholder engagement. And once we have that basic fundamental understanding of what stakeholder engagement is all about and what you're trying to achieve with stakeholder engagement, we then will move over into some exercises and examples of best practice where we can see this being implemented in practice. The second voiceover PowerPoint presentation will be we'll be looking at some engagement tools and their respective features. Remember that when we talk about management education, we largely conduct our education processes through models, tools, frameworks, and of course these model tools and frameworks are not meant to be a scientific foolproof way of delivering on your management mandate, whether it's in a marketing or stakeholder engagement or finance function, but instead it gives you a sense of structure in how to approach these very complex issues within your organization. And then lastly, we'll be looking at a few of those tools in a lot more detail, and we'll be applying our minds to some of the communication elements associated with maintaining good relationships. And then we'll also be looking at some of the best practices from around the world that you can go and read a lot more about to understand how some of the best organizations in the world deal with stakeholder engagement and the concerns and the elements that come to mind when dealing with these different stakeholder groups. All right, so stakeholders. The first step in understanding stakeholder engagement is, of course, understanding who stakeholders are. So one of the more detailed definitions around stakeholders come from the International Integrated Reporting Council, which is an organization that governs the integrated reporting practice guidelines and integrated reporting developments around the world. And they define stakeholders as those groups or individuals. So that's the first element, to understand that stakeholders could be individuals, it could be people, it could be interest groups, it could be organizations. And so within your organization, it's important to drill down into the detail to understand to what extent these interest groups represent themselves as individuals or groupings. So that's the first element. We then move over to the second element. So it's those groups or individuals that can reasonably be expected to be significantly affected, right? So remember that when we talk about stakeholders, essentially we're talking about all those entities that have a stake or an interest in the organization. That organization being your organization. And so if we look at the definition broadly, one could argue in an extreme sense that your organization affects everybody. Okay. However, we don't find use in having such a broad definition, and of course we then need to drill down into those groups or individuals that are significantly affected by your organization. So there should be some meaningful effect that your organization has on them or potentially has on them. And those effects could come from your organization's business activities, meaning your supply chain, your distribution chain, your employees, the product itself, etc. Could be through your outputs or outcomes. So it could be through your actual products, how those products or services are affecting people. It could be certain of your goals that are in conflict with the goals of other organizations. And those actions can reasonably be expected to, again, significantly affect the ability of the organization to create value over time. All right. So in essence, stakeholders are those groups or individuals that either affect your organization or can be affected by your organization. Okay. And that effect that either you have on your stakeholders or that they have on you has a time frame attached to it. So it's useful to consider whether those effects are short-term, medium-term, or long-term, and that gives you an understanding of the urgency around how to engage with certain groups. Of course, the most pressing needs need to be addressed immediately because those effects are within the short term, and of course in the medium term, less urgent but still important, and in the long term, obviously you need to adopt a very different approach when you have a long-term view of stakeholder engagement and building relationships. So that's a broad definition. So how do we start identifying the different stakeholder groups? So within smaller organizations, most managers or leaders have an intuitive understanding of who the different organizations and the different individuals are that they affect or could affect the organization in turn. So if we look at this diagram also from the International Integrated Reporting Council, it gives you a neat understanding of how to start considering who the different stakeholders or interest groups are that have either an effect on you or you affect in turn. Okay, so let's go through some of these to get an understanding at a broad level of how to identify the stakeholders that would be relevant for your particular context. Okay, so of course the government is always relevant in almost all contexts. As a non-profit organization or as a business, there are certain rules that come from the government in terms of legislation, in terms of government groupings, in terms of regulatory bodies, and those interest groups vary from industry to industry. So within your particular sector or industry, there's particular legislation that affects you, which you need to be aware of. How that legislation is typically enforced, you need to be aware of. And at a more sophisticated level, how you could contribute to the shaping of that legislation in time to come. We then speak about your competitors. So your competitors, of course, very, very intuitive interest group that you are always aware of. So who are the organizations or individuals that could take away market share from you or impact your ability to deliver on your goal or mandate? What are they doing better than you? What could you do better than them? And of course, all the competitive forces then come into place. In a typical business context, that would be things like pricing, it would be things like customer service, it would be things like convenience, location, it would be things like your range of products, it would be things like how new your products are, how fresh they are. For instance, if you're within the food industry, etc. So your competitors also one of the more important stakeholders to definitely be aware of. Okay, consumer advocate groups. Okay, and this is where it starts getting a little bit tricky and a little bit political as well. So depending on the type of sector that you're in, there are advocate groups, interest groups that have a direct impact on the way in which you run and manage your organization. So, for instance, there are consumer advocate groups that, for instance, would promote a green agenda and say that we need to start moving towards more environmentally friendly practices in our manufacturing processes, in our day-to-day operations, and they would hold organizations to account that don't take those principles seriously. So we've seen a significant rise in the last few years around awareness of environmental factors. And so those are the types of organizations that could affect you depending on your operation context. We then talk about special interest groups. So special interest groups are very industry specific or organization specific. So for example, if you're dealing with the mining industry or the construction industry, where labor or any of the labor intensive industries around, one of the special interest groups that you would deal with in South Africa are your trade unions. And of course, that also becomes a challenge in maintaining profitability, but also maintaining decent salaries and decent working conditions for your employees. And a lot of companies sort of mismatch those two, and that gives rise to protests and unrest, which of course then needs to be dealt with in order to maintain the satisfaction of all those involved. The media then plays also a very, very important role. With the rise of social media, the ability to grow a brand or simply tarnish a brand has become very, very easy. With a lot of people who have access to social media platforms, it becomes a massive challenge to maintain brand awareness, but also to be able to match that with credibility. And so this grouping is what we refer to as your primary stakeholders, your secondary stakeholders. So those are typically organizations that have an effect on your organization at a broader level. At the core of that is, of course, you, the firm, and immediately around you are your customers, your employees, your suppliers, finances, so such as your banks and financing organizations, and of course the communities in which you operate. So in identifying your stakeholders, it becomes very important to demarcate and identify the different specific interest groups within each of these organizations or industry sectors. All right. So how do stakeholders affect value? Why is it important to know who they are? So it's important to know who your stakeholders are from the perspective of knowing how they can affect you. Okay, and typically the way they can affect you is through what we refer to as the 6 capitals, which gives you a very useful understanding of how stakeholders can affect you. And so if we break down these so-called 6 capitals into its different components, you'll see that each of these are very, very important within your organization, but need to be considered both within an isolated context and within an interconnected context. Okay, so when we talk about financial capital, for instance, okay, there are certain organizations that could affect that could directly affect your financial position and your financial well-being. Okay, so for example, from a financing perspective, we talk about your finance houses, your banks, your investors, etc. Okay, their interests need to be met because they could simply either pull the plug on your financing or make it very difficult for you to obtain financing later on. All right, so those would typically be your financing organizations that could affect you in a financial capacity. All right. We then speak about your manufactured capital. Okay, and so manufactured capital are typically the sort of physical objects that enable you to conduct your operations in all of the stakeholders around that. Okay, so for example, in the production of your goods and services, it's your equipment, your buildings, it's in all of the people in organizations that are responsible for maintaining those buildings and organizations and equipment. Those buildings and equipment, etc. So all of the suppliers in the maintenance staff behind looking after core pieces of equipment or physical settings that enable you to do your work becomes very, very important. From a security perspective, that's also quite important. If you don't have access to your buildings, or if your buildings are not secure, if your workplaces are not secure, that becomes very difficult for you to be able to conduct your day-to-day operations. We then talk about intellectual capital. Okay, so these are typically people who contribute knowledge-based intangibles in organizations that hold intellectual know-how into the business. So again, when we talk about things like your patents, copyrights, your licenses, the custodians of those licenses. So for instance, within a mining perspective, for example, without your mining license and without the know-how of conducting mining operations, your organization could come to a halt very quickly. And so those stakeholder groups that are responsible for issuing licenses, maintaining your licenses, renewing licenses becomes very, very important. And so you would need to deal with those people and those interest groups in an appropriate way. Your human capital, very simply put, is your staff. So it could be your management teams, your executive leadership within the organization. It could be your factory workers, your manufacturing staff. So all of the people that play a role in conducting your operations, their interests need to be looked after as well. We then speak about social and relationship capital. So social capital in essence stems from the social license to be able to conduct your work through your organization, and that stems from certain societal norms, certain values, behaviors that stem from the society and the community within which you operate. And so those subtle nuances, those cultural, religious sensitivities that are prevalent within your markets become very, very important to be aware of. And so, for instance, maintaining good relationships with certain religious groups or cultural groups becomes very important depending on the nature of your operations. And of course, natural capital stems from your environmental responsibility. And when we speak about nature, the quality of air, water, land, minerals, etc., all of the natural resources that you need to conduct your operations also becomes very important to consider from the perspective of who the custodians of those resources are. So, for instance, certain interest groups around maintaining suitably green stance become very important to look after. Certain government organizations become very important to look after. Certain lobbyists and interest groups around pollution and greenhouse gases, for instance, become very important to look after. And so when we look at these different capitals, it gives us an understanding or a framework which we can use to understand who it is our operations affect and how those organizations could affect us in turn. And so in a nutshell, this lecture really stems around the fundamentals, understanding how to identify stakeholders, number one, and then secondly, identifying how they could affect us, and in turn, how we affect them. And once we've got that under control, we then move over into the next step, which is understanding their interests and power dynamics more deeply, which we'll be covering in the next slide. Sorry, I meant the next set of slides. So this brings us to the end of the first module around stakeholder engagement. I look forward to catching up with you in the second voice over PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much.